never understood, or maybe I should say I never appreciated, the power of the nameless voice. How could they say anything that wouldn't be readily available to me? How could they see something that I'd be blind to? How would they show me something I didn't already know? Yet this tends to be a central mark of what it means to be nameless. The dominant narrative, the dominant voices, always assume a right to be able to speak for you. The nameless are always being talked about, rather than to or with. The first time I felt the power of nameless speech was when I was in a circle of men, discussing the actions of women in public. There were women present, but none were named, none spoke, because quite honestly, in that conversation, they were talked over, overshadowed, and there wasn't really room unless they forced and insist. The topic was public flirtation introductions. So naturally, all of us nice guys, myself included, belabored the same point. Namely, if we're all free to express desire, then there is no problem with randomly approaching a woman in public to hit on her. I mean, how else were we supposed to get dates? Now, it will shock everyone, but this statement, this insight into culture, was met with resounding applause by all the male participants. Like, we truly had a keen and woke insight into society. But then, we, the enlightened men, thought that the problem that needed to be named, and that which needed to be centered on, was a theoretical equality. Could we agree with the statement that all people have a right to do something? Yet, when it doesn't hinder us directly, when it doesn't really affect my actions, I can speak all day of the nameless. But whatever is done does not affect my actions or inclusion, so it remains comfortably theoretical. If women are trying to be equal, we decided, they should learn how to simply just say no, rather than getting mad or playing games with us. I mean, really, how hard is communication? And once more, even these insights were well received by all participating male audience. Until one of the silent, nameless women spoke. Ironically, I cannot remember her name, but her words stay with me. When she disrupted the expected discourse and said, "You guys need to talk to women before making such loud claims, not just talk about them. Women have had to learn how to not say no directly, or to make a no seem like a maybe, to avoid dangerous harassment or getting cornered in a room." She began to tell story after story of her female friends who said no bluntly and were grabbed, threatened, insulted, called every epithet the man could think of, and then were blamed for being too cute in public space. So they were trapped. And we suddenly had to awake to what it was to be the woman in the altercation, having to think through where you go, who you're going to be around, what paths to walk home. And we realized that our theoretical speech stepped over female bodies. The nameless spoke, and suddenly our short-sighted stories no longer worked. The nameless spoke, and we had to come face to face of the farce that is driven by an explicitly male storyteller. Because we needed the nameless to speak, so we could see the holes in the way we saw things. In a similar way, the Bible has a habit of troubling the expected narrative through the inclusion of the nameless. The things that get troubled have to do with boundaries and redemption, of who gets to be a part of the good people. Now, Matthew does this as he interweaves Jesus' story with the story of Israel's journey through Exodus and the conquest. Because remember, when the Gospels are written, when some of these stories are coming to light, the thing to be echoing in the back of their mind is, how did we take such a great land, and how do we keep this land? So you would have echoes of conquest and war, of God showing up and battalions being at our side. So in this telling, Jesus is commissioning disciples in the same way that Moses commissioned Joshua to say, this is what it'll look like to take the land. Let me show you how to step into this. The hearers will be expected to catch echoes from the stories when God first walked the land with God's people. And during that time, God brought Israel into the promised land. And the land was not ready for Israel because a people needed to be purged to save the land. The indigenous needed to be slaughtered to get the uncleanness out. Matthew 15 wants this story of the first conquest in the back of our minds, and to make sure it's explicitly there by adapting Mark's story of the Syrophoenician woman. Because in Mark, which is probably the first telling of it, it's a woman from a living people from cities that you could trace lineage. But as many scholars note, when Matthew adapts it, he chooses a name that has not been used in ages. He chooses a name that draws our mind back to the conquest. And he says, you need to remember the forgotten ones from the conquest of Canaan, when the land was prepared by sacrificing all native lives to your purity. So the Syrophoenician woman becomes Canaanite. Thus, just like the conquest story of Joshua, which we should always remember, is what Jesus' name was, because Jesus is the Hellenized version of Joshua. So, just like the conquest story of Joshua, God is walking to the lands of Canaan, preparing a way for God's people to inhabit there. And there's only one thing that can stand in the way: the people that are already present. So, as we understand this parallel between Joshua and Jesus, who is the new Joshua, the conquest is seen to be happening again. Except, what will the acts of the new Joshua be? This is a good time to remember that in this story where God enters a land as Jesus, we can accidentally read these stories superimposing our definitions of God over the acts of Jesus. So when we become displaced, when we become unsettled, when we become unsure, we default and just say, okay, when these things happen, as we see Jesus, we know we see God. So what we say of Jesus, we say of God, and vice versa. What we say of God, we say of Jesus. So when we see an act we don't like, don't understand, or think it's distasteful, we default to our definition of a God who never changes, who is all power, all knowledge, complete mercy and goodness. Even though in the first conquest, we'd have to say that the mercies of God were shown to Israel at the price of the people that were already there. But if we superimpose these things over it, we won't be able to appreciate any of the growth or development becoming possible. We'll see the change in Jesus, the development of Jesus, as an impossible act, because God is static. Yet, Jesus reveals what God looks like and shows us that when the nameless speak, even God changes. The narrator tells us that as we enter into the story of Matthew 15, we're coming into Tyre and Sidon, which Matthew 11:20 has already said that they are related and grouped with the cities of Sodom and Nineveh, wicked cities of Canaan, cities that were judged and condemned by the wrath of God to get rid of idolatry and impurities in the land. Jesus and his disciples have just finished talking about such a thing. The first part of 15, it is an inner group of the nice guys discussing and defining who can be a part of this land. What defiles a person? What makes you unclean, unworthy? And as they're going through this, they enter into the land of Canaan, as it mentions, a land that they would see as defiled since the first conquest of Joshua. When suddenly, an unnamed Canaanite woman disrupts their lessons by crying out, "Show me mercy, Master, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." Now, if you're looking at your translations, it might say Lord, because it's kurios, which is a ranking of power. But when we see Jesus, we often want to do this because we're saying what we say of Jesus, we say of God. So when she's speaking directly to him, we translate it Lord. But that misses the subtle critique of Jesus. When she says that a dog eats from her master's table, it's still saying Lord. So through this, we're going to reference it as Master, saying, Master, you're obligated. And then the master of the table. So she comes and she disrupts. "Show mercy, Master, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." This brazen act opens up a set of 4 movements marked by 4 responses of Jesus. The first one, she's crying, she's calling out over the pain, and it says Jesus ignores her, did not reply with a single word while she's crying out, kept walking. The disciples come to Jesus, not because she's in need, she's a Canaanite, who cares? But the nameless refuse to shut up. So the disciples come before him and say, Jesus, send her away. She won't stop following and crying out after us, which gives the implication that they've been walking for a bit, that she's making a spectacle of fools, she's disrupting. And then Jesus bypasses her. He turns to her and says, "You are not my mission. I was not sent for you. I was sent for the lost sheep of Israel. This is the conquest of your land. It's the conquest of you. This mercy does not extend that far." The nameless woman prostrates herself. Says goes in front so they can't keep walking without stepping over her body. And says, "Master, help me." Then the third response of Jesus dehumanizes her. "It is not good to take the bread from the children to feed the dogs." Now, many male scholars spend endless pages trying to justify this statement of what could be meant by dog to make it less insulting. They try to take the bigotry of seeing her as a foreign other, therefore she's called dog. They try to take the sting out of the harm. But a few female scholars have had pointed responses to this. For these apologetic readings that want to take away the dehumanizing effect of the insult. And so I'll quote. One scholar writes, "Seeing Jesus as having a knowing smile on his face so that the insult is just really a test is an apologetic reading unjustified by the text. Nor does the point that the term for dog really means puppies or household dog soften the response. Because as every woman knows, being called a little bitch is no nicer or more humanizing than bitch. Yet driven by faithfulness towards her daughter, this nameless woman finds her voice and challenges Jesus. She said, "True, master, yet the dogs still eat from the crumbs that fall off their master's table." She tells the Son of David, the Lord, that he owes life to her daughter, even if he only sees her as a little bitch rather than a human. He still owes action. He still owes the humanity, the compassion for her. The nameless speak, and we see it is God who changes. The nameless Canaanite speaks, and the land is saved by her healing rather than her death, purified because of her presence rather than her absence. Jesus changes his response in the fourth one. Says, "Woman, you possess great faithfulness. It will happen as you willed it." Now, we don't see any sign of faithfulness in Jesus. There's no proclamation of messiahship in the sense of like saying, the way we would talk about, do you recognize Jesus as God? She's recognized Jesus as one in power. She said, "Kyrios." Now we see Lord with a capital L, so we think this is some divine statement. But she says, one with power, one with power. Your power obligates you to the powerless. And he says, "You're not my people." She said, "One with power, you own the table. You are obligated to feed the people." Her faith, her faithfulness was towards her daughter. Jesus was moved by her faithfulness found in the Canaanite woman towards her daughter and said, "It will happen as you willed it, not as your faith, as your will has dictated." Jesus was on a mission and willing to bypass her as she cried out for help for her daughter, help from demons tormenting her. The nameless woman had to disrupt, had to lay in front of his path and challenge the way he saw his mission. Some scholars say this passage anticipates Acts 10, when Peter has to learn the same thing for a Roman to be brought in, where God brought divine action to say, "This too is part of my people." This is the power of the nameless. Last time God came to Canaan, the native people were nameless and remained voiceless, sacrificed for the sake of purity. Matthew adapts Mark's story so that this time, when God shows up, the nameless speak and God witnesses to their virtue. You, a Canaanite, possess great faithfulness, something the first conquest denied. You will have it happen as you willed it. Your child will be healed. The nameless speak, and God changes. And this is the beauty of what Jesus shows us is true about how we relate to God.